Picture this. Deep space, somewhere between the outer rim colonies and absolute nowhere. A signal suddenly cuts through the cosmic static, like a knife through silence. It's broadcasting on emergency frequencies so old that most species have forgotten they even existed. We're talking about communication channels that were abandoned 3 centuries ago when the galaxy moved to newer, faster systems. But this wasn't just any signal. This was pure terror, broadcast into the void. The source? A little colony world called Whisper Falls, way out on the edge of Zilani space. Beautiful planet, really. Rolling purple grasslands, crystal clear lakes, and these amazing floating cities that the Zilani had built using some kind of anti-gravity tech that made human engineers weep with envy. About 2 million souls called home, mostly families who'd moved there for the peaceful life. Kids playing in those floating parks. Parents working in the agricultural centers. Grandparents telling stories under those twin moons. Now imagine all of that being systematically devoured. The Korthak swarm had arrived like a plague of mechanical death. These things weren't just ships or robots or some alien species you could reason with. Think of the worst nightmare you've ever had about insects, then make them the size of city blocks and give them an appetite for entire worlds. They move like a single organism, thousands of biomechanical constructs working together with one horrifying purpose: consumption. They'd start with the outer settlements, strip mining everything useful, breaking down matter at the molecular level to feed their endless hunger. Then they'd move inward, layer by layer, until nothing remained but empty space where a world used to be. No negotiation, no mercy, no survivors. Just efficient, terrifying consumption. Every major species in the galaxy received that distress call. The elegant Altarians with their crystal ships and superior attitudes. The militant Drachner, who claimed to be the greatest warriors in known space. The tech genius Vorthan, who could build computers the size of molecules. Even the mysterious Ethereals, who rarely bothered with lesser species affairs. They all heard it. They all understood exactly what was happening. And they all did absolutely nothing. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, which sounded impressive until you realize their emergency session lasted exactly 47 minutes. Ambassador Veltar the Altarian spoke first, his voice carrying that typical condescending tone they use when discussing regrettable but unavoidable losses. The Drachner representative, General Fexmore, actually laughed when someone suggested a rescue operation. The Korthak are beyond conventional warfare, he declared. Any fleet sent against them becomes part of their biomass within hours. So they did what politicians have done since the dawn of civilization. They offered thoughts, prayers, and standard protocols. Evacuation recommendations for planets 3 systems away. A moment of silence for the inevitable loss of life. Emergency sessions to discuss forming committees to study the possibility of maybe considering a response. Meanwhile, Whisper Falls was dying, but there was someone else listening that day. Lisa Parker, a communications officer stationed at Relay Station Echo 7, orbiting the 3rd moon of an unremarkable yellow star. Lisa wasn't supposed to be monitoring deep space emergency channels during her shift. She was supposed to be tracking commercial shipping routes and updating navigation beacons. Boring work that paid the bills and kept her busy while her husband Tom finished his engineering degree back on Earth. Lisa had always been curious, though too curious for her own good. Her mother used to say. So when that ancient distress frequency suddenly came alive, she tuned in. She heard the official parts first. Colony designation, population numbers, threat assessment, all very professional, very bureaucratic. But Lisa had good ears, and she'd grown up in the shipping lanes where you learned to listen for the things people weren't saying directly. That's when she heard them. Voices in the background. Small voices. Frightened voices. Zilani children crying for their parents in that musical language of theirs. A little voice asking when the scary monsters would go away. Another one wondering if the sky people would come save them like in the stories. Lisa's blood went cold. She'd seen the intelligence reports about Korthak attacks. There were never any survivors, especially not children. These kids had maybe hours before those mechanical nightmares reached their shelters. She sat there in her cramped relay station, surrounded by blinking lights and humming computers, listening to alien children face their last moments while the entire galaxy shrugged and moved on. That's when something inside Lisa Parker snapped. Not broke, but snapped into focus like a puzzle piece finding its place. She opened a new channel and began typing a message that would change everything. Lisa's message hit the human shipping networks like wildfire. Within 3 hours, it bounced through every freight depot, mining station, and colony outpost in human space. The message was simple. Alien kids were about to die, and nobody was coming to help them. She'd attached the audio feed, those terrified little voices that had kept her awake for the past hour. That's when Captain Jake Morrison got the call. Jake was docked at Armstrong Station, 3 days into what was supposed to be a week-long shore leave. His ship, the TS Relentless, sat in dry dock getting her hull patched and her engines tuned. Jake was nursing a beer in the station bar, trying to forget about overdue payments and the constant stress of keeping an aging freight hauler profitable in an increasingly competitive market. Then his first officer, Beth Chun, burst through the bar doors with her tablet in hand and fire in her eyes. "Captain, you need to see this," she said, shoving the device under his nose. Jake listened to Lisa's message twice, heard those children crying, saw the attached intelligence reports about what the Korthak did to populated worlds. By the time he finished reading, Beth had already called the rest of the crew. The Relentless wasn't built for heroics. She was a Hercules-class freight hauler, designed to move cargo containers between star systems as efficiently as possible. 140 meters of functional ugliness, with a hull that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt made of metal. Her main engines were 30 years old, held together with replacement parts cannibalized from 6 different ship classes. The artificial gravity flickered during hard accelerations. The air recycling system made weird noises that nobody could identify, and the coffee maker had been broken for so long that the crew just accepted it as part of ship life. But she was home to 43 humans who'd spent their lives in the deep black, and those humans had just heard children crying for help. The crew meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Jake laid out the facts. They'd be flying into a combat zone against enemies that had never been defeated. Their ship had no weapons beyond some industrial mining lasers. They'd be outnumbered by something like 1,000,000 to 1. The Galactic Maritime Authority would probably arrest them for violating about 15 different interstellar laws. "So who's in?" Jake asked. Every hand went up. These weren't soldiers or heroes. They were mechanics, engineers, cargo handlers, and navigation specialists. People who'd grown up on asteroid mining stations where the radiation levels would kill most aliens in minutes. Kids who'd learned to walk on spinning habitats where a moment's carelessness could send you flying into a bulkhead. Adults who'd spent years breathing recycled air that tasted like metal and drinking water that had been filtered through systems that recycled everything. And we mean everything. They were the descendants of humans who'd looked at the most hostile environment imaginable, the vacuum of space, and decided to make it their backyard. Their great-grandparents had built homes in places where the temperature swings could freeze nitrogen solid or melt steel. They'd raised families in tin cans hurtling through radiation fields that would sterilize entire planets. Within 6 hours, the Relentless was space-worthy and burning hard toward the Whisper Falls system. Jake had maxed out their engines, pushing thrust levels that made the hull groan and the reactor whine like a wounded animal. They were moving fast enough to cross 3 star systems in 8 days, which was impressive for a freight hauler, but still might not be fast enough. The Galactic Maritime Authority noticed them leaving human space about 2 hours into their journey. The comm system lit up with official warnings, demands to turn back, and threats of legal action. Admiral Vexton of the Altarian Fleet Command personally contacted the Relentless to inform them that they were violating 17 interstellar treaties and heading towards certain death. Jake's response became legendary in human space. He transmitted the coordinates for Whisper Falls, along with a simple message: "Feel free to follow." The line went dead. Nobody followed. Instead, the galaxy watched in horrified fascination as these Deathworlders flew straight toward the most feared predators in known space. Their primitive vessel was bleeding heat signatures that any military sensor could track from 3 star systems away. The Relentless wasn't trying to hide or sneak past anyone. She was announcing her presence like a challenge. daring the Korthak to notice her. Most species monitoring the situation started experiencing what their medical professionals called acute psychological distress just from watching the sensor feeds. The idea of voluntarily flying toward the Korthak was so fundamentally terrifying that entire diplomatic corps required counseling. But the humans just kept flying, their ugly freight hauler pushing through space like a middle finger aimed at the universe itself. On the bridge, Jake Morrison sat in his captain's chair, watching the star charts and calculating their approach vector. Around him, his crew worked with the calm efficiency of people who'd already accepted that they were probably going to die. They just didn't care anymore. The journey to Whisper Falls took the Relentless through a cosmic nightmare that would have sent most species running home to their mothers. We're talking about the kind of space that advanced civilizations mark on their charts with big red warnings that basically say, don't even think about it. First came the solar storms. The route Jake had plotted took them dangerously close to a dying red giant that was having what scientists politely called irregular stellar activity. What that actually meant was this ancient star was throwing temper tantrums that could fry electronics from 2 star systems away. Radiation levels spiked so high that the ship's sensors started screaming warnings every few minutes. Most alien vessels would have turned back at the first radiation spike. Their crews would have been rushing to medical bays. Their sophisticated shielding systems would have been overwhelmed, and their navigation computers would have shut down to prevent permanent damage. The humans? They just cranked up the music and got to work. "Radiation's getting spicy again," called out Tommy Rodriguez from the engineering station, watching his displays light up like a Christmas tree. "We're at about 3 times what the manual says is safe. Manual also says we shouldn't use duct tape to fix the gravity generator," replied Beth from her station. "How's that working out for us?" They'd been living with radiation levels that would hospitalize most galactic species since they were kids. Growing up on asteroid mining stations and orbital habitats meant your daily dose of cosmic rays was just part of life. Sure, it probably wasn't great for long-term health, but humans had always been pretty good at ignoring problems they couldn't immediately fix. When their primary navigation array got fried by a particularly nasty solar flare, they didn't panic. They just pulled backup components from the cargo hold and jury-rigged a replacement using parts from a coffee maker, some mining equipment, and what looked suspiciously like a gaming console that somebody had smuggled aboard. The second major hazard was the gravity wells. The route to Whisper Falls took them through a cluster of neutron stars that warped space-time like a funhouse mirror. Ships that got too close would be stretched apart at the molecular level or compressed into something the size of a basketball. Even staying in the safe zones meant dealing with gravitational forces that could turn your bones to powder if you weren't careful. The Relentless groaned and creaked as they navigated through the gravitational maze. Hull played stress beyond their design limits. Internal supports bent in ways that made engineers cry, and the artificial gravity system gave up entirely for 6 hours, leaving the crew floating around the ship like confused fish. "This is either really exciting or really terrifying," announced Kelly Walsh, the ship's pilot, as she manually adjusted their course around another gravity anomaly. "I haven't decided which yet. Can it be both?" Jake replied, strapped into his captain's chair and trying not to think about how the hull was flexing around them. Most species would have needed months of therapy after experiencing gravitational forces like that. Humans just complained about the floating coffee and kept working. Then came the debris fields. Space around Whisper Falls was littered with the remains of worlds the Korthak had already consumed, chunks of dead planets, twisted metal from destroyed ships, and things that sensors couldn't quite identify drifted in vast clouds of cosmic wreckage. Flying through it was like navigating a 3-dimensional minefield where every piece of debris could punch a hole through your hull. The crew worked in shifts, manually plotting courses around the larger pieces, while their point defense systems tried to handle the smaller ones. For 72 straight hours, someone was always on watch, eyes glued to sensors, calling out obstacles and course corrections. When they finally reached the Whisper Falls system, what they found would have broken the spirit of any sane species. The planet was dying. Korthak bioships covered its surface like metallic tumors, each one the size of a city and connected to the others by writhing conduits that pulsed with stolen energy. They were feeding, literally consuming the world piece by piece, breaking down matter at the atomic level and incorporating it into their ever-growing mass. In the underground shelters, the few surviving Zilani huddled around their scanners in disbelief. Their long, graceful fingers trembled as they adjusted their instruments, certain they were seeing things wrong. But the readings were unmistakable. A single ship, clearly human in design, had just dropped out of hyperspace and was heading straight for their doomed world. "Impossible," whispered Dr. Cale Venn, the senior scientist among the survivors. "The creatures from the Death World, they actually came." The Zilani had heard stories about humans, of course. Everyone had. Tales of the violent species that had somehow survived on a planet so hostile that most aliens couldn't visit it without environmental suits. Stories about Deathworlders who built homes in places where the radiation alone should have killed them generations ago. But stories were one thing. Actually seeing it happen was something else entirely. The Korthak noticed the new arrival immediately. Bioships began detaching from the planet's surface, their organic hulls rippling with anticipation. They moved like predators that had never encountered prey foolish enough to come looking for them. Hundreds of the massive constructs began converging on the tiny human vessel, their collective consciousness already calculating how this new biomass would be incorporated into their swarm. This should have been the moment when our heroes realized they'd made a terrible mistake and tried to run for their lives. Any rational species would have taken one look at those approaching bioships and calculated the overwhelming odds against survival. But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy never quite understood. We're really, really bad at accepting that something can't be done, especially when there are kids involved. Jake Morrison looked at his crew, saw the determination in their eyes, and smiled like a man who'd just been dealt a losing hand but was planning to bluff anyway. "Well," he said, "this should be interesting." What happened next became the stuff of legend, though most galactic military academies still refuse to teach it because it violates everything they know about proper warfare. The moment the Korthak bioship started moving toward the Relentless, every military expert monitoring the situation expected to see standard defensive maneuvers. Maybe the humans would try to run, or attempt some kind of clever flanking action, or at least calculate their odds and surrender gracefully. That's what civilized species did when facing impossible odds. Instead, Jake Morrison did something that made seasoned admirals across the galaxy question their own sanity. He aimed his freight hauler directly at the largest concentration of enemy ships and hit the accelerator. "Captain," Beth called out from her station, "sensors are detecting over 300 bioships converging on our position. Should I plot an evasive course?" "Nope," Jake replied, adjusting their head to put them on a collision course with what looked like the Korthak command cluster. "Take us right down their throats." The thing is, humans had actually done their homework. While the rest of the galaxy treated Korthak attacks like natural disasters, something you ran from and hoped to survive, human analysts have been studying every scrap of data they could get their hands on: old battle records, survivor testimonies, even debris analysis from destroyed worlds. What they discovered was fascinating and terrifying. The Korthak were absolutely perfect predators, but they were perfect in a very specific way. They'd evolved to hunt prey that followed predictable patterns, fleeing, hiding, or fighting conventionally. Their bioships were designed to counter shields, outmaneuver fighter craft, and overwhelm traditional fleet formations. But they'd never encountered prey that fought back with the kind of chaotic creativity that comes from spending your entire evolutionary history on a planet that's constantly trying to kill you in new and inventive ways. "All right, people," Jake announced over the ship's intercom as Korthak bioships closed in from all sides. "Time to show these things why Earth is considered a death world." The first trick they pulled would have gotten them court-martialed in any civilized military. Tommy Rodriguez had been studying the ship's waste processing systems. Not the most glamorous job, but somebody had to understand how their recycling worked. He'd noticed that their organic waste processors created a particular kind of electromagnetic interference when they were overloaded. "Captain, I can soup up our waste systems to create a broad-spectrum sensor jamming field," Tommy called out. "It'll smell terrible and probably violate about 50 environmental regulations, but it should blind their targeting systems." "Do it," Jake ordered without hesitation. Within minutes, the Relentless was surrounded by a cloud of processed organic matter that completely scrambled Korthak sensors. The bioships, which relied on precise biological targeting systems, suddenly found themselves trying to hunt a ghost that kept appearing and disappearing on their displays. But that was just a warm-up. Kelly Walsh, their pilot, had been studying the ship's power distribution systems. "Hey, Captain," she said, "what if we overloaded our fusion reactor just enough to create an electromagnetic pulse? Not enough to blow us up, just enough to fry their nervous systems." In any sane military, this suggestion would have resulted in immediate psychiatric evaluation. Deliberately destabilizing your own reactor was the kind of thing that turned ships into very short-lived stars. But Jake just nodded and told her to make it happen. The EMP burst that followed disrupted Korthak coordination across the entire system. Bioships that had been moving in perfect formation suddenly found themselves confused and isolated, their collective consciousness temporarily severed. It was like watching a hive mind suddenly develop amnesia. But the humans weren't done yet. When their improvised weapon systems finally failed under the strain of jury-rig modifications, they did something that made military historians across the galaxy weep. They started ramming Korthak vessels with their freight hauler while simultaneously launching evacuation pods toward the planet's surface. "This is insane," Beth muttered as another impact shook the ship. "We're using a cargo vessel as a battering ram." "Insanity is just creativity that nobody else understands yet," Jake replied, ordering another ramming run against a bioship that was trying to reform the Korthak battle line. The evacuation effort was pure human improvisation at its finest. They converted their cargo pods into makeshift rescue vehicles, loaded them with emergency supplies, and launched them toward the Zilani shelters, while their ship played bumper cars with creatures the size of city blocks. Each pod was piloted by crew members who'd volunteer for what amounted to a one-way trip through a combat zone. They flew through debris fields and energy discharges that should have vaporized them, guided only by determination and the kind of spatial awareness that comes from growing up in three-dimensional environments where up and down are purely theoretical concepts. By the time Galactic Council reinforcements finally arrived, drawn by sensor readings that their computers initially dismissed as impossible, they found something that defied every principle of military science. The Korthak swarm was retreating, not destroyed, not defeated in conventional terms, but genuinely confused and disoriented by prey that refused to behave like prey should. They pulled back to regroup and analyze what had just happened to them, leaving behind a debris field full of damaged bioships and a freight captain coordinating refugee evacuation while his vessel literally fell apart around him. Jake Morrison, standing on a bridge where half the control panels were dark and the other half were held together with spare parts and determination, calmly directed rescue operations like this was just another day at the office. The galaxy would never be quite the same. The news hit galactic civilization like a meteor strike, and the shock waves just kept spreading. Within hours of the rescue, survivor testimonies were flooding subspace networks across known space. The Zilani refugees didn't just talk about being saved. They told stories that fundamentally challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about the violent species from the death world called Earth. Dr. Kaelvan, the senior scientist who'd been monitoring sensors during the attack, couldn't stop talking about what he'd witnessed. The human engineer, Rodriguez, he gave me his emergency rations when he saw my children were hungry, he told reporters from his hospital bed on the rescue station. His own ship was falling apart, his reactor was failing, and he was probably going to die in the next few hours. But he was worried about whether my kids had enough to eat. The stories kept coming, each one more incredible than the last. Human crew members who carried injured Zilani through toxic smoke and radiation that should have killed unprotected organics. Deathworlders who'd used their own bodies to shield alien children from falling debris during the evacuation. Medical Officer Patricia Wells, who'd treated severe injuries with what she called battlefield medicine, techniques that somehow worked better than the advanced medical systems the Zilani had been using for centuries. She didn't have proper medical equipment, explained Nurse Valera, one of the Zilani medical staff. Just basic supplies from their emergency kit. But she understood trauma treatment in ways our computers couldn't match. She saved lives that our advanced systems had already written off as hopeless. The galactic medical community was baffled. Human medicine was supposed to be primitive, brutal, focused on keeping soldiers alive just long enough to fight again. But these humans had treated alien physiology they'd never encountered before, using techniques that seemed to work on pure instinct and experience. Then there were the stories about the evacuation itself. The human crew had converted their cargo pods into rescue vehicles using nothing but spare parts and creativity. Each pod could only make one trip through the combat zone, and everyone knew it was basically a suicide mission. But 43 humans had volunteered to pilot those makeshift rescue craft, and somehow 37 of them had made it back. "They came for us," whispered little Zarlin, a Zalani child who'd been evacuated in one of the pods. The scary monsters were everywhere, and the sky was burning, and then the sky people came and carried us away to safety. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. The Galactic Council faced angry delegations from member species, who were asking increasingly uncomfortable questions. Why had they abandoned an entire world without even attempting a rescue? How had one primitive human vessel succeeded where their combined fleets would have supposedly failed? What did this say about their military capabilities, their moral leadership, their basic competence? Ambassador Veltar the Altarians tried to maintain the party line during an emergency session. "The humans succeeded through pure luck and reckless endangerment," he declared. "Their actions were heroic, yes, but completely unrepeatable and tactically unsound." "Then why?" demanded Representative Vaxera of the Centauri Republic. "Did our own military analysts conclude that the Korthak were impossible to fight? Are you saying our entire strategic doctrine is wrong?" The questions just kept coming, and the answers kept getting more embarrassing. Military experts who'd spent centuries studying the Korthak threat were suddenly being asked to explain why they'd never considered the tactics that a human freight captain had improvised in 8 days. But the real moment that changed everything came in Jake Morrison's final transmission. The Relentless was dying. Her reactor was in critical failure. Her hull had been breached in 17 places, and her life support systems were running on backup power that wouldn't last much longer. Jake Morrison, standing on a bridge where half the control panels were dark and the other half were sparking dangerously, transmitted one last message to the galaxy. He started by sending coordinates. 17 star systems where intelligence indicated the Korthak were planning their next attacks. World with names like Haven's Rest, Crystal Falls, and New Sanctuary. Places where families lived and children played, and people went about their daily lives, completely unaware that mechanical death was heading their way. Then came the part that haunted every species that heard it. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the TS Relentless." His voice calm despite the chaos around him. "To anyone receiving this transmission, we confirm that the Korthak can be fought and beaten. It's not easy and it's not pretty, but it can be done. The coordinates I've transmitted show 17 worlds that are marked for destruction. Each one represents millions of lives." There was a pause as something exploded in the background of the transmission. "Now I have a question for all you advanced, civilized species out there. If the galaxy won't defend itself, exactly how many more distress calls are we humans supposed to answer alone?" The transmission ended there. The Relentless went dark 47 minutes later. Her crew evacuated to the rescue ships that had finally arrived from Galactic Council space. But that question echoed through diplomatic chambers, military academies, and civilian forums across known space. It stripped away all the comfortable excuses and political rhetoric and laid bare an uncomfortable truth. The most violent, primitive species in the galaxy had just demonstrated more courage and moral clarity than all their advanced civilizations combined. The Deathworlders hadn't just saved one world. They'd held up a mirror to galactic civilization, and nobody liked what they saw staring back. The reflection showed species so comfortable, so risk-averse, so wrapped up in their own superiority that they'd forgotten what it meant to help someone in need. The galaxy would never be quite the same again.